Let me start. I am extremely happy to have both guys here on the stage. Why? Because Lucian just right now explained what he, as a professional journalist and a blogger and a man who is observing what's going on in the world and particularly in America, feels about mass media role of intervening into people's thinking. And I will ask him to think about and to tell about it to you, the audience, in more details later. And Viesturs is the right person, to my mind, to sit here and to think loudly about the same subjects because he is not a media person. He is not a person who studies mass media, but at the same time he thinks a lot about how society works. And of course, today the impact of using media on how society works and what decisions society and its groups make, its media, it's very important. So I think we will have a great discussion, useful for you. I will start with a little presentation for those people in the audience who are Latvians. You know what it is. This is our greatest writer and illustrator for kids, Margarita Staraste. It's her book, and the first story of this book is called Netici blēņām, which is in Latvian, which means in English, don't trust bullshit. It's written and illustrated in 1964. And the plot of the story is that a hen heard the cow hitting the doors of the barn, and the hen thought this is the end of the world. Then she ran through the field and she was crying to everyone, this is the end of the world, this is the end of the world. And everyone started to follow her. Here you can see many animals are following her because everybody thinks that now the end of the world is near. And at the end of the story, they all dropped into the water, and it was kind of refreshing for them because they realized that no, it's not the end of the world. What I want to say is that I think that the distinction between, I would put it provocative, between clever people who had their internal critical thinking and media literacy centuries before it was named media literacy, and stupid people who are trusting untrustful sources and who are naive and who are ready to catch on some sensations. This distinction is going on for thousands of years since the birth of the civilization, and in different cultures, in different stages of civilization, people like Margarita Staraste created the fairy tales, the stories, to educate people not to trust bullshit. Now I will come to my first question to Lucian. Is what's going on now and what you just described with this anarchy of media, you use this term that media is quite in anarchy, that people are in echo chambers, that people more and more say, I read it on internet, and people are more and more hostile to journalists. All this you described. Is this to you, does it seem to you like change of paradigm and something what can lead us to a very tragic end, if I may say it? Or what I wanted to show with this, the distinction between clever people and stupid people has been already for thousands of years, and we will survive it, and it's just another form of this distinction.
Well, I think what we have here is a technology being such a major disruptor, and I agree that it's important to keep this all in context. I think if we look back at, for example, the invention of the printing press, and what this did, there was such a monopoly on knowledge before books were published. Basically, it was controlled by the church, at least in Europe. And there was very difficult if you had any alternative opinions that you were trying to make to get them out. So, in some ways, I think what we're experiencing is something probably comparable to the invention of the printing press. We're still trying to figure out. I think after people began printing, their literacy increased. It was easier to distribute all sorts of different knowledge. I think this obviously also affected a lot of political and religious changes in Europe and the rest of the world. So I agree that we don't need to. I'm not trying to paint a completely black picture. I'm American, so it means I have to be an optimist. But I think we're still. I also tried to point out that I think we're still figuring out how it all works. The problem with the technology is that it's equalized everything. So people sit in their Facebook feeds, and it doesn't matter if you see an article from the New York Times or from Delfi or from some news site nobody has ever heard about, and nobody even knows who's behind it. It looks all the same, right? It's a complete equalizer that we never had in the analog world, where small fringe publications would have trouble distributing anywhere. I mean, they're physical newspapers. So I think we're still figuring it out. I don't want to be completely pessimistic, but I think a lot does have to do with media literacy, because I mean I have friends that I've known for a long time that ask me, well, how do I know what I'm supposed to trust? And I mean, I think the question is very, very legitimate.
Step in, please.
Right. Well, I'm not a media person. I'm an anthropologist, so you should probably take it as a grain of salt. But I've got qualifications that I'd like to ask for conversation. Because I think that if we talk about journalism as a one broad topic, it doesn't help at all. So I think we should, at least I would suggest we differentiate between news reporting, investigative journalism, channels, and funding. And I think all of those issues, of course, are all related, and they all exist within Delphi or CNN and BBC, but they might have different issues behind them. I don't think that news reporting are going away. I think investigative journalism perhaps is under more strain because it's more expensive, more time-consuming, and less people are perhaps invested into that. Channels, obviously, but yes, digital technology has changed, but it hasn't changed everything. Shoes manufacturers, piano makers, everyone's affected by that. So it's not going anywhere. So either we adapt or whatever, we die. And if someone dies, who gives? I mean, then I think that's an important issue. Another two things you mentioned at the beginning, that at first we thought that digital technology is going to change journalism, and that's going to be the existential question. And now the existential question is truth. Well, that has been an existential question forever, since we have legs. So I don't think that those are two questions would actually really undermine journalism as we know it. The truth and issue, who to trust, is a fundamental question of human reality, and does not just apply to journalism as such. So journalism embodies one part of the world, and I think there are other parts of the world, and public sphere is in general under kind of a reconstruction, and so is journalism. Do you think it's helpful for us to distinguish this conversation and perhaps a debate later on between news reporting and news being accurate, opinion-based or fact-based? Number two, should we talk about investigative journalism and generally how do people form opinions about the world and have ideology? So, for instance, BBC openly is making a mock of Donald Trump, and when I go to BBC, I don't expect them to be mocking Donald Trump. I mean, they might, but when I read other news, I hope that they're not partisan for other issues. And then number three is that should we talk about channels, the print and the digital. So if you think that makes the debate more specific and perhaps more precise and more accurate, and then the questions could follow in more accurate fashion, I think that's perhaps some way to go on. Do you think that's a relevant way?
Your first question was about distinguishing between news reporting and investigative reporting. I mean, I think what you said.
I think all I'm saying is, if the conversation is about we have to fight for attention or people's attention, then let's distinguish in: do we fight for the news or investigative journalism or channels or general understanding of how educated our public is? If we put it under one roof, the conversation is we can't have it in half an hour. We won't finish it, and we have any accents on that, I think.
Well, I think even 20 years ago, when newspapers were still publishing long articles, I mean, already then we had this question about how do we keep people's attention. I mean, I think, of course, a lot of these debates have existed for a long time. I'm not saying these are brand new phenomena and that they're going to change the world. I mean, but I think with the technology has just sort of focused or made these problems much more evident. I mean, what you said about the BBC was interesting, because I think also in the US we have a lot of news outlets that are traditional news outlets which have become much more partisan, you could say even anti-Trump. And this is again where you have this, did I come here to get news, or did I come here
to get opinion?
To get an opinion, and sometimes it's very hard. And I think, of course, Donald Trump has also changed the debate a little bit because he has directly attacked journalists. So I think people then feel very defensive once they feel like they're under attack.
But my question is, if you were to choose one issue that it's a game changer, what would that be? Is that accuracy of news? Is that investigative journalism? Is that the channels, or is that people's attention span? I don't think you can do anything about people's attention spans. We're not gods, and what the hell, right? I mean, what are we supposed to do with that? If they can't hold attention, that's their business. They're going to lose a job. It's not exactly our business to nurture people's attention span. Then perhaps our job is to make sure. I mean, if we're part of the media, our job is to make sure that we're accurate and truthful. And
yes, I think that's the priority.
And then the rest will perhaps follow, I think.
Well, I mean, I absolutely agree.
So instead of kind of us lamenting about the degradation of public sphere, we should do something about it with the way we report news. If they're accurate, truthful, and if we're working with investigative journalism, we will have to make sure that it's exciting. I think Tolstoy hasn't gone away. Have you seen the bricks he wrote? Or Dostoevsky hasn't gone away, and there's still parts of the population that read it, and probably that won't go away. So I think as long as Tolstoy and Dostoevsky is on, we also should have a chance. People go to BBC for quick fix. They go to New Yorker for longer reads, or Atlantic. I think that's it. There's a space for everybody. The question is, how do you fund the New Yorker pieces? How do you fund the Atlantic pieces? How does Delphi fund the things that they go in depth for the elections, or for the Rail Baltic, or for any other issue? That's the big thing. So maybe funding is one big issue. And perhaps, we'll talk a bit and then let's open the room for questions. What do you guys think are the most pressing issues that we could address?
I agree with you, but just one remark before we involve the public. I think that the reason behind our lamenting, as you said, from what I feel being a media person, is that this noise of distrust, which we know is very loud last years, have somehow struck our self-confidence, and some of us a little bit are afraid that what you suggest, just do your work correctly, do your work accurate, do your work splendid, is not enough. That we must also jump into kind of self-defending ourselves with loud marketing tools of why journalism is better source of information than everything on the web.
That's a good question. That's a good question. Well, one issue has been addressed, I think, in some of the kind of more liberal outlets, such as Guardian. And obviously there's mistrust, but I think everyone's dealing with mistrust. No one believes anybody anyway, except some of the guideposts that you have. Some people believe Fox News, and they do believe in them. And they perhaps aren't critical. And then some people are, followers of Guardian or New Yorker. So I think we're just becoming more tribe-led society in general. So it's not. So all I'm saying is it's not like there is a scheme out there to take out the journalists in specific. And there are some attempts, but I think you look around, there are other things that are being defeated by this new revolution, the Gutenberg 2.0. There are other things taken out. Shops closed one by one. You could say that that's Amazon scheming against the shops. I don't think that's the case. I think it's just part of the digital revolution in general. It's a question of how can you survive. And I think we all know that there are digital media outlets that have survived over the last, the Instagrams and Twitters and bloggers and citizen journalists, they have survived and they're still going on. So I don't think that it's the end is near. I think that we've been, we've been talking about the end of the near for the last 100 years, and democracy, and that like every generation says this is the end. You guys are, you're just ruining us, and it's obvious you're ruining us, and we'll be dead in 10 years. I don't think it's. I'm not that pessimistic. In other words. I'm
also not pessimistic.
Lucian, I think you're the more perhaps cautious.
I think we're just seeing as far as journal. I mean, I'm looking at as a journalist, and I think we do have. There used to be a monopoly of information held by a very small group of media outlets, and now because of this decentralization, which I said, it would seem like this is an extremely positive and empowering process, but in fact, it's just turned into many, many voices, and where no one really cares about their reputation. I think this is also important. Is a lot of people are interested, and I see this especially on my Twitter feed. People don't care about their reputation anymore. They don't want to be seen as some kind of neutral or fair arbiter. They have a very distinct point of view, and these are often journalists. And I think that's also a negative development.
Okay, that's an important issue.
But
all right.
maybe.
So should we go on with the conversation or open up to the?
I think
floor?
We should open up, and if I may add, if it doesn't suppress somehow your digital or other freedom, I would prefer that we hear questions from those who are not from media, because that's very interesting for me to think what they are thinking about what media should do or not. But it doesn't mean that you can't start. But we need for streaming reasons to be to have mic with you.
Do we have mics? All right.
this is just more of a comment addressed to Lucy, and I think we share a lot of been there, done that, because I've been a journalist for a long time. But I think we should focus on one problem. When you talk about the rise of conspiracy theories, the rise of hostility towards journalists, this is a very actual problem here in Latvia. We have a person forming a government, or trying to form a government, that is one of the most media-hostile politicians that I've seen in Latvia in a long time. And this issue should be brought up. And this puts journalists in the strange position. Okay, one side you report the facts, you strive for accuracy, you strive for doing both sides of the issue. But there cannot be both sides of the issue of open attacks on the press, closing down government to transparency, which is part of the policies of the who owns the state KPV-LV party, of threatening to fire journalists and of threatening to arrest journalists. Actually filing criminal defamation complaints against 2 investigative journalists. This is a scandal. This is where we have to stand up and say no to this government, and literally I'm ready to print a "Not My Prime Minister" t-shirt like there were examples in the US. So I don't know, what is your opinion, or what do you guys think about, should journalists also take a kind of political stance and say, no, we do not accept censorship, we do not accept this kind of almost gut-level attack dog hostility toward journalists that was displayed by this political party in the campaign leading up to the elections? And then they said, oh, no, sorry, we're open to everybody, which is a crock of shit in my mind.
So the question is not just the Latvians, but because that's the case in Hungary and Poland
well,
and
it's
US.
part of the trend.
This is
It's
not
part of the trend.
It's not a
It's part of the
national
trend.
reality.
It's also what Trump has done to the media.
Yeah, of course, CNN case in White House.
Right. I mean, I'm not exactly familiar with the situation right now in Latvia, but obviously exactly what you're saying sounds like what we were experiencing in the US when Donald Trump became president. And I think I said at the very beginning, I'm not a technology pessimist or skeptic, but the phenomenon of someone like Donald Trump is also thanks to, well, first of all, thanks to TV. He used to be a TV personality. And then his Twitter account. And I think these, in one way you could say they're very grassroots democratic because they can reach so many people. But at the same time, I think through his Twitter account, he's been able to be reach so many people and sort of change and cheapen the debate. And I think it's a huge problem in the United States. What are you supposed to do as a journalist when someone says that an accurate and truthful article is fake news just because the president doesn't like it, or calls journalists the enemy of the people? I mean, Donald Trump has done this multiple times, and this is unprecedented for the United States. I think really where also freedom of speech is held so highly, to have the president use his powers to attack the press. So it's concerning, and I just to say we're going to stick to the facts and we're going to be truthful and do our news reporting in this kind of environment, in this polarizing environment, it almost forces journalists to become participants. And I think if you're a professional journalist, you actually you want to be outside of the debate.
I can add that, of course, the attitude of these guys arises the willingness of us media persons to involve into the war. Of course, me too personally have considered, I was talking with myself a lot during last months, should I start a war with Gobzems? Me as, meaning the whole Delfi newsroom. But there's always the other side, what Viesturs described, that, well, if I'm reading BBC and I'm feeling it's more partisan that I'm waiting for BBC to be, then perhaps this explicit war is not something what's the right decision, and you should express your attitude as a journalist, as an editor, as a media outlet towards these fascist guys with more intelligent, more, as Viesturs said, accurate, fact-checking, responsible tones of voices, like Anne Applebaum did in this recent Atlantis article, which was translated in Riga's likes in Latvia about Poland. It was splendid. I was crying how intelligent was this critics to Polish government.
I think one of the problems, though, about saying, okay, we're going to stick to the facts. I mean, I think the Washington Post has done this numerous times, just published articles of all the times that Donald Trump has said complete falsehoods. I mean, I don't know if you call them lies, but maybe things he made up, which are simply not true. And you can say, well, that's, you know, they're doing their jobs. And I think, I remember at National Public Radio, we had a long debate. If Donald Trump does not say the truth, if he actually says something that is false, do we call it a lie? You know, what is a lie? I mean, this was a debate inside the company. What is a lie? Is a lie, you know, do you have to be knowledgeable of what you're talking about? Is it intentional? And if you just say something that you just, you know, invented in that second, is that a lie? The problem is, again, the echo chambers. Everyone who reads the Washington Post is going to understand that, but it's already a self-selecting crowd. And the people that maybe should be aware of this, they probably don't read the Washington Post because it's fake news. And everyone is stuck in their echo chambers. And I think that's, you know, we can present all the facts as much as we want, but who are we reaching?
If we keep on optimistic note, then we are reaching those who are who are willing to change their minds. Those in between echo chambers.
Hello. I unfortunately missed the very beginning of this panel or discussion. However, last week I was at a conference with participants, politicians, business people, media people from 9 countries, Nordic countries, Baltic countries, and the United Kingdom, that had a whole session on fake news. And there were some very, very eminent former well-known BBC journalists and the like from different places. And the discussion around fake news was actually how deeply pernicious it has become in our societies, and that it's actually wrong to call fake news because they're outright lies. So the question is, or they're either lies or propaganda, and we accept the terminology, you know, of fake news. So the question is, how do you behave? Because all of us like entertainment. And a lot of fake news and the way that technology can target audiences, as you know, we will hear throughout the entire day here, means that you have very selective news going forward, which therefore goes to 2 other audiences. One is the user of news, and the other one is the creator of news. And therefore, the creators of news actually have to be better at their jobs. And journalists, we actually have less people going into genuine journalism with the ability to communicate coherently to broad audiences or telling the stories in whichever you know, language you have, and being believed. And the other one is the audience. And therefore, we as recipients of news actually have the duty, and our education systems actually have the duty to teach readers to be more critical of news sources and the way that news is presented. And the second half is the harder one, because all of us, including myself, goes into our own little bubbles. You say, it's the New Yorker or the Washington Post, and is it Delfi, or is it, Fox News, or is it, what is it? Delfi in Latvian is different from Delfi in Russian, and is different from Delfi Estonian and Delfi Lithuanian with the same news. And I know that because I follow certain news pieces around it. So even there's already a change in attitude. And I don't know how to change that. It would be interesting to hear from people here who are of a younger generation, certainly than I am. How do you perceive news? Do you care, actually? Do you care about the work being done by the people on stage? Because I have the feeling that people don't care anymore. The more entertaining it is, the better. The better snapshot, not words, but pictures, the more influential the news.
I think the trick is to use the opportunity of technologies for making your content more sexy for audience, but to remain the quality of the message. And that's what we are trying to do.
Far too kind, far too kind. We only have 5 minutes by Edvard, as far as I understand, so we have to pay. Well, there are fantastic points raised by but I don't know how can we address those in the panel. We have time here. But I think that, well, it's kind of a larger issue to what we have at hand. I think that the news outlets and journalists in general, as a one important piece of the public sphere, I think they have, I think more than others, to stand up for the public values, and one of those values is transparency. So the question is, how do you not combat preaching to the choir issue? So I think that's, the people who read Washington Post, they'll continue doing so. So the question is, how do you reach out to Fox News people, because they think that that's the fake news, and then the elite media is basically just kicking Trump in the foot wrongly and accusing them. So I think one of the ways of how to address that is to expose on their own terms. So one way of what's been done with this new party is that they used to film stuff when the sessions were in the parliament. They're no longer filming the stuff. So why aren't you filming that? So I think that's one of the ways how you can actually reach out to the audience and say, well, this is what you guys are doing. So that's I think one measure. Second measure is, I think it's way too late for us to talk about what these media outlets do or not. It starts way earlier, so it's a higher school and primary school. The media literacy of what kind of media are we consuming in the first place. It's way too late if you're 25. You don't give a crap of who. No one's going to tell me what to read or not. So I think that's a fundamental issue. And I would say it doesn't start in the school; it starts in the family. The school is again way too late. So I think, well, a household, family is a very, loaded in term. Say household or partnership, whatever you have, if you've got kids, whoever raises them. So that's an issue to be addressed way too early. And I think the kind of a hobby horse being said, oh, education is going to take care of it. So there isn't a single discussion in this country which doesn't end in saying, oh, education has to take care of it. It's like a trash ground. Oh, they'll take care of it. Whatever. The nuclear waste, education. Transport, that's education. Culture, education. Everything is about education, which I think is nonsense. Doesn't work like that. And finally, I do agree with Ingus in this point. These are disruptive times, and extraordinary times do require extraordinary measures as well, once in a while. So, I mean, the BBC hasn't changed their outlet and form for 25 years, and I don't think, I still go to the BBC from my Europe. I go to Al Jazeera for my Asia stuff, and for inside to Atlantic and New Yorker. But I still, they haven't changed much at all. And then all this new other world of Instagram and Twitter and other forms of communication with people, they haven't caught up that at all. They need to learn something. Otherwise, they're going to be left with white men in their 40s reading news and being angry about how everything is going to hell or something.
Okay, that's it for this discussion. The time's over. Please give a round of applause for our speakers.